So let me introduce our guest speaker today, somebody who's very close to my heart. This is my brother, Zach. He studied in Yeshivat Ma'ale Adumim for 13 years, if I'm not mistaken. 14 years, and was very close with the Rosh Yeshiva there, Rav Nachum Rabinovitch, who was one of the most unique halachic voices of his generation. And I thought it would be very interesting for us and for our series of learning how to learn and learning how to approach halakha, for us to hear from somebody who was very close to the coal face, as it were, who understands how the Rosh Yeshiva thought and how he approached halakha. And so without further ado, Zach, please take it away.
Welcome, everybody. When Sam asked me to give a share about Rav Rabinovitch, I was very happy to oblige. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about in general. And that being said, I didn't realize how difficult a task it would actually be to put together a shiur which would be comprehensible. Because to understand certain points, I'll need to very quickly gloss over relatively complex sugyot. You'll forgive me for being extraordinarily cursory in all of the sugyot that we'll touch upon, mainly because each one of them could be a shiur in its own right. But when you're talking about the way a posek understands halakha, it's impossible to do that without getting into the nitty-gritty of certain details in sugyot. The way the shiur is going to work, I'm going to break it up into 3 parts. If anybody, I would prefer that the questions be asked after each part, but if something is unclear, feel free to break in. Just because of the way Zoom works, it can be confusing if people break in as someone's talking, but after each part, I'll add time for questions, and I'd be glad to hear questions and answer questions. I'm going to break up this shiur hopefully into 3 parts, hopefully get to all 3 parts. The first part is an overview of the way Rav Rabinovitch saw the Torah and halakha and how it functions. What's going on? What are we doing when we're approaching Torah? What are we doing when we're approaching halakha? Very broad general statements, almost on a philosophical level. The next section will discuss his independence as a posek, which was, I think, probably the most important aspect of him as an individual, as a mechanech, as a teacher, and as a posek, was demanding critical and independent thought. And I think that's fundamental to understanding who he was and how he approached halakha. And the third part will be understanding how he saw how psika works, and which includes the way tshuva is supposed to be written, why certain psikot may seem strange because he may not have explained himself to a full extent, or the way he dealt with minhagim, accepted custom, etc., etc. So let's get into it. The way Rabinovitch saw the Torah in general was that it was very Rambamistic, which isn't surprising because he was a big Rambam scholar. He was a well-known Rambam scholar. And that means that the Torah in general strives to achieve certain goals. And the way those goals are understood is within a broadly Aristotelian framework. What does that mean? An Aristotelian framework looks at politics and ethics. Politics meaning generally the way society works and the rules, norms, and goals of political existence, social existence, from the level of moral norms through law. The way that Aristotle and the Rambam see halakha and see law and the Rambam halakha is as helping and facilitating man actualizing his spiritual intellectual potential. Spiritual/intellectual, meaning for the Rambam, the spiritual potential is essentially intellectual potential, in that man needs to understand God and the way the world is run by God and pattern his life according to that same understanding. And the law, which is the halakha in this instance, is directed towards facilitating that. Now, since intellectual growth and development and actualization of potential is a very individual pursuit, and it depends on a person himself thinking about deep issues and understanding the way the world is run and trying to pattern his own moral virtue on those same ideas and patterns, law can't really directly actualize that potential. What it can do is create a framework in which man is free to do, but not only free to do, it creates the conditions under which he can actually do so effectively. And one of the main conditions is moral virtue. Another one of the main conditions is a peaceful and generally run society, a society which there's no theft and murder and violent crime, etc., etc. And beyond that, a society in which people care for each other and help each other, and the poor are given opportunity and such. And as such, the law, the Torah in general, is directed towards creating those conditions. And since the Torah is directed towards creating those conditions, that means that the laws that the Torah commands us to do, to uphold, must necessarily reflect that. And so the posek, the individual who's deciding what the halakha says, he needs to have a very deep and fundamental grasp of three things, I would say. One, broadly, the goal of the Torah. And Rav Rabinovitch repeatedly emphasizes what he says, כבוד הבריות, אהבת הבריות, ושלום הבריות, הם היסודות של כל התורה. Meaning, the underlying goal of the law is to promote human dignity, love for others, and peace amongst the individuals who make up the society. And he bases himself on many statements of the Rambam, the foremost and maybe the pithiest being what he says at the beginning of Hilchot Shabbat, which I neglected to bring on the source sheet that I made, but I will read to you from the Rambam. When he talks about Shabbat being, sorry, you have to exclude my English. I'm used to talking about Torah in Hebrew, but I'll do my best. Where he talks about Shabbat being pushed aside in favor of pikuach nefesh and saving people's lives. And he says, 1 second. He says, you're not allowed to hesitate in any way to violate Shabbat to help somebody who is sick and in danger of losing his life. Right? Man should do these laws, keep these laws, and live according to them. He should not die according to them. Meaning you learn from this that the laws of the Torah don't cause anger or pain, but they are kindness and compassion and peace in the world. And that overarching goal must be what guides the posek when deciding what the halakha in a particular case should be. So you need a grasp of what those terms mean. What does it mean to be kind, to be merciful, and to promote peace? Because it's not necessarily a very simple, just do whatever's nice. Because something being nice can have bad consequences, meaning the famous statement that anybody who has mercy upon the cruel is essentially being cruel. And things like that, where certain laws take a long view, certain laws take a medium view, certain laws take a short view, meaning you have to be able to synthesize the different aspects of reality. And that's the second thing the posek needs to understand, is how reality works. Posek has to have a good grasp of human nature and of the nature of society, and in order to effectively make halachic decisions. The third thing that a posek needs is an understanding of the specific law under question, meaning that if, I'll take an example that will stay with us throughout most of this year, is Hilchot Shabbat. Shabbat, in certain circles, can become very, how would you say that? They can become burdensome, because people can be worried about breaking the laws of Shabbat all across Shabbat, and then fail to actually rest and reach a certain level of internal peace and relaxation, which is necessary, which is the goal of the laws of Shabbat, which is necessary for the loftier spiritual pursuits that Shabbat is designed to make time for. And according to the Rambam, Shabbat has two main goals, one of which is to remind us that we were slaves in Egypt and to thank God for his kindness in releasing us. And the other is to allow us to really think and reach more spiritual levels, higher spiritual levels. Of course, there's time for family time and for social bonding and things like that. But the loftier goal of Shabbat would be to allow us to really understand and think about the more spiritual aspects of our existence. And if I'm worried about not breaking Shabbat all the time, I live in a certain level of stress that doesn't allow me to reach those spiritual heights because I'm worried about not breaking Shabbat. And the posek needs to understand that, needs to allow that to guide his psika in Hilchot Shabbat. I'm going to read a sentence that I translated from the quick aside. Rav Rabinovitch has several writings, one of which is his monumental Pirush on the Rambam called the Yad Pshuta, which we'll quote from several times. Another is two responsa shutim, one of which was written for soldiers, but can be read in a broader context. And the other is his classic shoot called Rav Nachum, which all of which we'll discuss to an extent throughout this year. And he has a book in Jewish thought, in Jewish hashkafa, and he has a chapter about psika u'manigut rabbinit, meaning halachic decision-making and rabbinical leadership. And so he says there that it's not... Someone needs to... There we go. It's nigh on impossible to make a halachic ruling in any field without attempting to understand the goal of the mitzvot and their effects on the behavior of individuals and society as a whole. The posek must not see any particular decision as an independent ruling, but must instead ensure that it accords with the goals of the entire Torah and serves the goal to benefit us for all days and to give us life as this day effectively for both the individual and society. Meaning that when we look at Torah and when we look at the law that we're deciding at any given moment, we need to have the Torah's goals in mind. And it's impossible to make halachic decisions without taking that into account, which leads to a point which has been many have pointed out that Rav Rabinovitch was a relatively makil posek, meaning as a halachic decision maker he was relatively lenient, and the reason for that it's not by chance. So we can actually see a source that I brought here that he quotes from the Rambam's letter. You should see it on your screen. This quote is from the Rambam's letter. The letter itself discusses riding in a ship on large riverways on Shabbat was an issue in their time. And he says he wrote a letter allowing people to ride on ships on Shabbat in large rivers, whereas the Geonim in Babylonia in modern day Iraq forbade that. And he says, the Rambam says this, מה שזכרתם מהתעלותם במנהג, מנהג הוא דבר שצריך להיזהר בו מאוד. ובביאור אמרו ז"ל, דברים שאין של היתר ואחרים נהגו בהם איסור, אי אתה רשאי להתרם בפניהם. Meaning the Rambam says, you noted that there is a custom not to get on boats on large riverways on Shabbat. And it's very important to take minhagim into account. And there's even a Gemara that talks about a group of people who have a custom to forbid a certain activity in general. You're not allowed to permit others to do that activity in front of the people who have forbidden it. Meaning, it's something that in and of itself is permissible, but since a certain group of people have taken it upon themselves to forbid a certain activity, one is not allowed, posek is not allowed to permit that activity to those people. But he adds, Aval, tzarich letnai shebe'aro haTalmud haYerushalmi. You need the condition that the Yerushalmi mentions. והוא שצריך לידע שאותו הדבר מותר, ואוסרו על עצמו מצד שמדקדק על עצמו. And the person who forbids it, or the people who forbid it, they forbid it on themselves because they want to be more careful. Meaning they know that this action is allowed, but they have to be careful about certain rules for whatever reason. אבל אם היו אנשי אותו מנהג, חושבים בדבר מותר שהוא אסור, if these people thought that what they were doing is forbidden according to the law, and that's their opinion, they think it's actually not allowed. And all the more so if they brought some proof or some logical inference that supports this action being forbidden, it is entirely improper to allow them to continue to think that action is not allowed. אבל צריך למחות בידם ומודיעים להם שזה שחשבו שהוא אסור מותר. And you must tell them that what they thought was forbidden is actually allowed. ונפל באיסורו טעות, and they erred in disallowing it. And in a later letter, which actually expands upon the previous letter that I quoted, he says, we already explained, what's proper is you should allow for every individual whatever you can. And we won't burden him with all sorts of extra rules. But an individual who, for whatever reason, wants to be more stringent upon himself, he's perfectly allowed to do that. But the ruling for a group of people should always lean towards being more lenient. Now, it's a statement that a lot of people don't like because they say you need to focus on the truth. And that's true, you need to focus on the truth. But the understanding here is that part of that truth isn't just the internal workings of a particular sugya, and we'll discuss that a little bit more later on. But it's understanding the goals, the broader desire of the Torah and what it is trying to achieve with these rules. And often, I would posit that usually being more stringent or worrying about more opinions, etc., doesn't facilitate reaching those goals, but can in fact hinder it significantly. And Rav Rabinovitch was very intent on being makel whenever he could. For that reason, because whenever it was proper, there are certain rules where it's improper. For instance, dinei yichud, which have to do with men and women being secluded in a particular place. Rav Rabinovitch is actually very machmir about this. Or about, for a classic example that students like to bring, is Rav Rabinovitch was disinclined to allow a young couple to get married and not have children immediately. Meaning intentionally to prevent pregnancy immediately. Meaning disinclining, of course there are certain cases where it would be allowed, but disinclined in that he would encourage them to not take that approach, because there's an understanding what a family is. A family isn't only a husband and a wife. A family is a husband and a wife and a child. And what the goal of marriage is. Meaning he was always led by his understanding of the particular goals of the particular laws that he is adjudicating from. He generally viewed halakha in an Aristotelian sense as opposed to a Kantian sense. And I'll explain what that means. I'll read what he says. He says that all of halakha flows from reality, and all of its values are founded upon the nature of man and society. And he opposes that to the view of halachic arbiters of poskim that see the posek as living in an abstract ideal world of ideas. This is something that can be seen specifically, I think specifically was talking about halachic man by Rav Soloveitchik, where the halachic man, and again, people disagree about how much Rav Soloveitchik actually endorsed the halachic man, but the way he's described is living in an abstract world of rules and trying to make reality fit into the category of those abstract rules. Whereas in Rav Rabinovitch's view, and again, because this is very much an Aristotelian view, that rules aren't necessarily a priori. They're according to what works. Meaning, in different societies, slightly different rules can work. In different situations, the rule needs to change very slightly or even significantly. Amongst two different people can receive two different answers because they have different perspective, they have different desires, they have different rules. Their personalities can accept and deal with different things. And different rulings will lead them to different places spiritually, and different societies have different expectations, etc., which can lead the posek to deciding differently in different cases. Now, of course, there's not never ending. You can't just decide whatever you feel like is right. You need to understand what the rulings that exist are, how they work, what they're leading to, and whether the particular case in which you're adjudicating has the same features that the other cases which were previously adjudicated have. And if they don't, then it may be that the ruling needs to be different because the Torah tries to achieve certain goals, and the laws flow from reality and from the values that are founded upon the nature of man and society, and it's not a priori categorical rules that always need to be followed in every situation. Meaning there's a certain sensitivity to reality. And if I'll conclude this section, I would say that halakha is a system of rules and guidelines designed to create societal harmony, cultivate man's individual virtue, and ultimately develop his deepest potential to know God. Most of halakha, by the nature of those goals, which is societal harmony, the cultivation of virtue, and the development of the potential to know God. Because of the nature of those goals, most of halakha focuses on the first two, meaning on societal harmony and the cultivation of virtue. But they create a situation, they create a society, they create an individual personality, which can then reach that deeper level of intellectual understanding of God. That's enough. If anybody has any questions about the general philosophy, now's the time. No, we're good. Okay. I never know if people are listening on Zoom. It could be that there are people no one's listening, and that's why no one has questions, but that's fine. Our next section talks about the way Rav Rabinovitch actually decided specific halachic cases. And the way he decided specific halachic cases was as an independent thinker. What does that mean? That means that it doesn't mean that he disregarded precedent. In any legal system, precedent and custom are very important. However, the actual law itself and the Talmudic discussion about the law is also important. Okay? And that led him to, the Rabbi Sachs would often tell a story about an article, I think, that he wrote for Rav Rabinovitch when he was a student in Jews College, in which he mentioned one of some posek. If I'm not mistaken, it was the Chatam Sofer. And he brought it to Rav Rabinovitch, and Rav Rabinovitch said, you mentioned the Chatam Sofer, but you didn't criticize what he said. And he said, what do you mean? He said, well, what he said is clearly incorrect because of A, B, and C. And you didn't even mention that. You didn't even mention there are any problems with what he had to say. Meaning that his expectation would be that you read what people have said, you think about it and understand where they're coming from, and then criticize it. Meaning there's no such thing as just quoting an Afron or just quoting a Rishon. You have to understand what they're trying to get at and criticize what they're saying in light of the sugya and in light of common sense. Common sense was a very important factor in Rabinovitch's halachic style. This led him, in certain cases, to use his own particular understanding of rules to make halachic rulings. And this was in all facets of halakha, not only in extraordinary cases and not only in day-to-day things, but in both. A few examples. Let's start with the one example we have some sources for. Again, you're gonna have to forgive me for the cursory nature of our discussions here, but I want to bring a few concrete examples just to make the point clear of using independent judgment to make halachic decisions. On Purim, the Megillah is read regularly on both the 14th and the 15th of Adar. It's read on the 14th in most places, and in all places which were surrounded by a wall in the times of Yoshua ben Nun, it's read on the 15th, which includes certain places, mostly certain places in Israel. There are discussions about certain places, but certainly Jerusalem. So you can use Jerusalem and Tel Aviv as our examples. And the Mishnah discusses an individual who lives in one place, for instance, in a non-walled city, and he goes to a walled city, and vice versa. And the Shulchan Aruch, which I didn't bring here, but the Shulchan Aruch quotes the Rambam's explanation, the way that he quotes the way the Rambam quotes the sugya. Okay, and let's read the Rambam. He says, Ben Ir shalach lekrach, meaning a person who lived in a non-walled city, who went to a walled city. Uben krach shalach leir, and the other way around, a person who lives in a walled city and went to a non-walled city. Im hayta da'ato lachzor lemkomo bizman hakri'ah, if he intended to return to his original home, meaning either the walled city or the non-walled city, depending on who it is, and he got stuck there, korekin komo, he reads like his place, meaning if he intended to be in his own place at the time of reading, which we'll need to discuss what that means, he reads like his own place. He intended to return to his place, but only after the time the Megillah is supposed to be read. He reads with the people in the place where he finds himself. Okay? The mathematical possibilities are several. Because you have two people in two places. So it could be that what the Rambam means by a person who is in the opposite place has to return by Zman HaKriyah. Let's talk about, for instance, a person who lives in a non-walled city and went to a walled city. The person who lives in a non-walled city is supposed to read on the 14th. And the walled city reads on the 15th. Okay? When did he intend to return to his place? On the 14th or the 15th? Unclear, because it could be Zman Kriya in the place where he finds himself. It could be Zman Kriya in the place where he normally lives. And so it's an unclear statement. And so he uses the Rambam's to disambiguate the statement Zman HaKriya. Okay? And so the Rambam says like this. Ima yada'ato lachzor limkomo belil arba'ah asar v'nitakev. He intended to return to his place on the 14th and got delayed. Az gorkim komo. Then he reads like his own place. And if he did not intend to return to his own place by the 14th, then he reads with his own people. And the simplest reading of this, and the way Rav Rabinovitch explains it, is that a person's status, no matter where he comes from and no matter where he is, dependent on where he intended to be on the night of the 14th. Okay? Meaning, let's say that I, who live in Ma'ale Adumim, a non-walled city, went to Jerusalem on the 10th of Adar. And I intended to stay for a week at my friend's until the 17th of Adar, right? I would obviously, no matter what, I would read on the 15th of Adar because Jerusalem is a walled city. But if I intended to return on the 14th of Adar in the morning, okay, I would read on the 15th of Adar, not on the 14th of Adar. Why? Because Bizman Kriya, which is the night of the 14th, I tended to be in a walled city. Okay? And that makes me what the Gemara calls mukaf ben yomo, meaning a temporary resident of the walled city. And I therefore read with the walled city no matter, despite the fact that I intended to and in fact did return to my own city, Ma'ale Adumim, on the 14th. Okay? That's in this paragraph he explains that. We can read it together. Nireh anu. Well, let's see together. Shemukaf ben yomo karui mukaf. Okay, how can a temporary citizen of a walled city be called a temporary citizen of a walled, be called a citizen of a walled city? Ben ir shenimsa biyudaled be'ir. V'afilu da'ato letzei lekrach be'leil tedvav. Hari adayin peruzu v'nichayev likro biyudaled. If I, a resident of a non-walled city, am on the 14th in the non-walled city, okay, then I am a resident of my non-walled city. I would obviously read on the 14th. ואם הוא כבר נמצא בכרך בליל י"ד, והייתה דעתו לחזור לעיר ונתעכב ולא חזר, הרי גם זה לא נעשה בין כרך אלא קורה כמקומו. And if I was there on the night of the 14th, and I intended to return on that same night, meaning I intended to be on the night of the 14th, okay, in my city, I read like my city. אלא הכוח מדובר במי שהגיע לכרך לפני י"ד. I got to talking about an individual who reached the walled city before the 14th. He does not intend to leave the walled city on the night of the 14th. He then has the status of a temporary citizen of the walled city because the time that determines when my individual status is the night of the 14th. Okay? Then I do not have an obligation to read until the night of the 15th. And then he talks about the Gemara, which is less important. This ruling is in contradiction to the way the Shulchan Aruch understood the Rambam. The Beit Yosef understood the Rambam, which he discusses in the Beit Yosef, meaning the Shulchan Aruch quotes the Rambam, okay, word for word. You have to rely on me for that particular point of information. You can check whether I'm correct afterwards, because I didn't quote it here. But in the Beit Yosef, he brings the common explanation to the Rambam, which is the Magen Mishneh, one of the Rambam commentaries. And this is what he says. He gives a different explanation. He says, Lo shanu ela she'atid lachzor b'leil daled aben krach shalach le'ir, meaning the Mishnah that says that he did not intend to return on the night of the 14th only discusses the resident of a walled city who went to a non-walled city. And then this is what it means. She'im atid lachzor limkomo b'leil yadaled kodem zman hashacharit, that if he intends to return to his city on the night of the 14th, before shacharit, before the morning, meaning that he does not have to read, he's not obligated to read with the people of the city, because he didn't intend to stay there for the day of Yudalid. And already there's a difference, because Rav Rabinovitch pointed out that what matters is the night of Yudalid, meaning do I intend to spend the night, to be in the evening, the time of the Kriyah, the night of Yudalid, in the unwalled city. If I do, then I have to read with the unwalled city. Here he says, no, we were going to be in the morning, meaning you take the entire night, and then where I plan to be in the morning, if I intend to return during the course of the day of Yudalid, or Zman Shacharit, before the time of Shacharit, is unclear exactly what that means, but it seems to be before the morning of the 14th. Then I have to read according to, an individual from a walled city has to read like the non-walled, should not read like the non-walled city, but should read like the walled city. Meaning there's already a difference, and that Rav Rabinovitch said that if he intended to be during the night of the 14th in the non-walled city, then he becomes a temporary resident of the non-walled city and has to read with the non-walled city. But there's another difference. We'll skip a little bit. Peruz ben Yamonika, peruz. Mukaf ben Yamonika, mukaf. Meaning that the opposite exists as well. Meaning that you can become, just as you can be a temporary citizen of a walled city, you can become a temporary citizen of a walled city. Klomar, did ben ir shalach lekrach, meaning in a resident of a non-walled city who went to a walled city. We also say, if he intended to return on the 19th, if on the 14th, on the night of the 14th, he intended to return to his original city by the night of the 15th, on the night of the 15th, okay? Meaning, what does that mean? That I only become a temporary citizen of the walled city if I intended to be in the walled city on the time that they read the Megillah, which is the night of the 15th. Okay? Whereas Rav Rabinovitch said what matters for everybody is the night of the 14th. The way the Beit Yosef understands the issue is that what matters is the night of the city in which I find myself. Okay? Meaning I intend by the morning to be in the other place. So there are two differences. One, Rav Rabinovitch says that it's not the whole night, but rather the beginning of the night. In the Yad Judah, it's a little less clear, but in Shiurim, that's the way he would be posek. And the other point is that the only night that matters is the 14th. There's a difference of understanding. Rav Rabinovitch said what the question if an individual needs to read is on the 14th will always be decided on the 14th. That's the underlying thought here. That if I need to read on the night of the 14th, is determined on the night of the 14th. And that's determined by where I am on the night of the 14th, because there's a halachic standing that obligates me on that night, either to read or to not read. And if I'm in a walled city, my halachic standing is an individual who needs to not read and needs to read the next night. If I'm in the not walled city, my standing is one who needs to read on that night. That's the way. That's the fundamental understanding that led Rav Rabinovitch to explain the Rambam the way he did. The course, the sources in the Rambam, the fact that the Rambam also says Leil Yadalid for both cases, leads him to accept that understanding. And the way the Beit Yosef did it is that the night of the 14th does in fact decide, but it matters where you intend to be on the night of the 14th. Meaning, I'll phrase that differently. It matters what your intention on the night of the 14th is to be either on the 14th or the 15th. Meaning that if on the night of the 14th, if I am a resident of a city, of a non-walled city, and on the night of the 14th, I intend the next night, the night where the walled city would read, where I currently find myself, I intend to be back at my home, then I don't receive the standing of being a citizen of the walled city, because I only become a citizen of the walled city if I intend to be in the walled city on the time that the walled city would read. Okay, which is a little bit different. And the Rav Rabinovitch would halakha l'maaseh be posek according to his understanding of the Rambam, meaning he has a source and he has a svara, and he would be posek according to his understanding of the Rambam, because it's essentially, again, that's what's written in the Shulchan Aruch, meaning the Shulchan Aruch himself would be posek like the way explained in the Beit Yosef, where to become a temporary citizen of a walled city, you need to intend to be in the walled city on the night of the 15th when the walled city reads. Whereas the Rambam, according to his own source, according to the Pirush Mishnah and the commentary on the Mishnah, and according to the simpler Svara, according to Rav Rabinovitch at least, said that what matters is only the night of the 14th, which is the time where you need to determine whether you must read or must not read. must read on the next night. And for that reason, the Rav Rabinovitch should always be posek. What matters is where you intend to be on the night of the 14th. If you intend on the night of the 14th to be in Yerushalayim, then you read like Yerushalayim. If you intend to be in Ma'ale Adumim, you read like Ma'ale Adumim. And it's not that you're going according to the morning, you're going according to where you tend to be on the night of the 14th. Like I said, it's a little less clear in the Abshut. That's exactly what it means, but halakha said that's what he would always be posek. Okay? I hope after all of that in-depth discussion, the point is relatively clear that Rav Rabinovitch what guided him was always two witnesses, text and svara, text and the reasoning that lies behind the text. And since the text under discussion is essentially what the Rambam is posek, since he is convinced, using various sources within the Rambam's writings, that this is what the Rambam means, that's the halakha. And that's what he would be posek to anybody who asked him. I'll give one more example. I have several examples here that I could have mentioned, but I'll try to bring the least in-depth example. Is, for instance, borer on Shabbat, meaning the prohibition to separate chaff from the wheat on Shabbat. Not chaff from the wheat, but anything from food from non-food items on Shabbat that are mixed together. Okay? The Achronim took this melachka on Shabbat to extraordinary distances. The Mishnah Berurah brings opinions that when you eat fish or chicken, you need to actually extract the bones from your mouth, because separating the chicken off of the bone would be a prohibited example of borer, because for borer you're allowed to take out what you want and leave what you don't want, and you're not allowed to take out what you don't, and you're not allowed to take out what you don't want and leave what you do want. And when you're separating bones from chicken or bones from fish, you're actually taking out what you don't want. And so to eat fish or to eat chicken, you may actually have to take the bones out of your mouth. There's another view in the Rambam. There's another view of the melachah in general. Okay, again, there's a very long discussion amongst the poskim, and I'm going to really get into it. But the Rambam has a different view of borer, which again isn't 100% clear from the Rambam himself, but in terms of the underlying reasoning, makes a lot of sense. And then we'll see this is what actually the Rambam did intend. There's actually very clear proof to this that Rav Rabinovitch didn't have access to, but later was published. The Rav Rabinovitch would always be posek that there's no borer until you actually have a mixture. Now, what does that mean? We can read together the Or Sameach, which is here, source number 14. He says, "Da sheborer gidrohu bedavar abalul yachad umishtamesh keshehu balul." Okay, which means the melacha of borer only exists in cases where you actually have a mixture, where things are used as a mixture. It doesn't mean that they're used mixed in with the non-food items. For instance, if you have rice and rocks, okay, it doesn't mean that you eat the rice and the rocks together. It just means that you eat rice as many things together. You don't take individual pieces of rice. Okay, that's what it means. Mishtamesh keshehu balul. Bezeh, only in cases like this, im borer me'oto psolim mitoch ha'ochel havi melacha. It's only in a case like this, if you actually do borer, if you actually separate out the rocks, you are doing the melacha on Shabbat. And then he says, the fizeh borer kli mitoch kli, de'atu mishtamesh behem kashen blulim, halo b'kol kara mishtamesh b'fnei atzmo lo shayach b'u borer. He says that in cases of, for instance, items that are used for daily use, for forks and knives, bowls, plates, that you only use one by one, anything you ever only use one by one, there's no such thing as borer, because borer is only piles of things. It's only relevant in piles of things, not in individually used items. And I meant to quote the summary of a shiur given by the Rambam, where he says a very similar thing, but I didn't get around to it. I apologize. What the Rambam says there is that quick background, there was a common custom to summarize shiurim given by rabbis in Arab lands, and the rabbi would then approve the summary, and then that would be an official summary of a shiur, called a ta'liq in Arabic. And we have one of these from a shiur of the Rambam where he was discussing the melachot dash and borer, and he says borer doesn't exist in large fruits like apples and oranges or things like, doesn't say oranges, he says pears or things like that, and not even nuts. It applies only in things like sesame seeds, very small items that you do not use one by one, which is essentially what the Rambam is saying. And Rav Rabinovitch didn't have that Rambam. But the Rambam is very explicit about that. And the way Rav Rabinovitch was always posek was according to this or samach, which was, no, there's only borer when you actually have a pile of things, and the pile itself needs to be cleaned from the various things that are mixed together. We are running short on time. And again, this could be a 5-hour-long shiur, so we're not going to go too deep. I want to give one more important example, which is that using the understanding of underlying values to guide psikah. An example of this is a controversial issue today, which is surrogacy. Rabinovitch was morally opposed to surrogacy in general. We can read what he has to say about it from his book, Megillah Bilvavam. He says this: in the modern liberal Western society, often when trying to reach equality, erases difference. Which can often be found with equality between the sexes. Some deny the inherent and natural differences between men and women, and for this reason try to deny the different functions that men and women play in society, meaning fathers and mothers, and claim that men and women are the same. There's no real difference between fathers and mothers, etc. And so he brings an example. There are many who try to create a sort of false equality for men. And they suggest that they bring children into the world through surrogacy. And by doing that, they destroy the natural connection between a mother and her child. And they turn women into sorts of machines for pumping out children. He goes on. But that underlying moral concern led Rav Rabinovitch to have two very unusual and distinct psikot having to do with surrogacy. He claimed that the surrogate mother is the halachic mother of the child. And he claimed further that the father, the individual whose sperm was used to impregnate this woman, is not considered the father. And again, he brings halachic reasons for this, which I'm not going to get into again because of the depth of the sugya. But part of the reason for that particular halachic ruling was his moral stance, and he felt that that was something that was unreasonable. Another example of his that he would often bring is Rav Rabinovitch is very makil, very lenient about fasting for pregnant and nursing women, because he said that the value of life needs to lead us in our halachic decision making. And nowadays that we have better ways of tracking the consequences of fasting on pregnancy and on nursing, we know that it can be very harmful, even cause miscarriages often. And the cause of a miscarriage is an unacceptable outcome. And so he would be very makil, he would be very lenient about allowing women to not fast on Tisha B'Av and allowing them to not fast even on Yom Kippur often. Again, the specific guidelines can be found in his writings, but he was led by his underlying understanding of the morality of the situation, not an external understanding of morality, but an understanding of morality which is led by the way the Torah looks at things. Meaning the Torah is interested in creating natural connections between parents and children, and building strong families, and preserving life, and things like that, and actions like that, which are כבוד, הבריות, what he says before כבוד, הבריות, אהבת, ושלום, הבריות, הם היסודות של כל התורה. And even though there are certain difficult aspects to these psikot, meaning the making surrogacy something non-desirable has a difficult side to it. You're saying to an individual who wants to have a child and can't, that I'm sorry, but you can't do this, which is not an easy statement. It's not something that makes everybody feel good all the time. That's not what כבוד, הבריות, אהבת, ושלום, הבריות mean. He claims you need to take a longer view. You need to take a view of what the connection between a mother and a child means, what motherhood means, what the role of a woman in society is. Those questions are the deeper fundamental questions which demand that a posek not only look to the short term, to the individual, but to the broader and the deeper concerns of what society is, of what morality is, of really getting a grasp on the philosophical underpinnings of the particular psikah. Again, our time's running short, so I'm going to leave off a few more interesting points, and move to the third part, which is how posek actually works. And here, Rav Rabinovitch has a fascinating article that he wrote called A Halachic View of the Non-Jew. He wrote this in tradition. I'm going to share it here. Hang on. Add this to our screen sharing. Where he actually discusses the way tshuvot work, which is fascinating because it's really it's a behind-the-scenes view of the way a person writing a tshuva thinks. It says purpose determines style. I hope you can see the PDF, I hope. Thus, the manner of presentation and the organization of the arguments and responsum are radically different from the approach used in a purely expository discussion. He explains why. It is not only a matter of traditional practice, but often essential to the validity of the conclusions, that the style of a tshuva is usually what we might call inverted. One treats at length all the arguments that might be advanced against the conclusion to be established. The most far-fetched argument is eliminated first, and one proceeds until all are rejected. The intended discussion then remains as the only possibility. The intended decision then remains as the only possibility, and the arguments for it are often dismissed in just a few words. Meaning, the often when you're writing a tshuva, you can say, this is the ruling, and these are the reasons that you would think this ruling is incorrect. Those reasons are incorrect because of reasons A, B, C, and D. And this is the ruling, and the ruling will be explained just in a short sentence. Meaning, you may actually, the underlying thought and the underlying reasoning behind the ruling may not actually be explained in full. It may be only mentioned in a short sentence. He continues, the purpose of responsibility is not primarily to explain why the law holds in a particular case. It is rather to prove that no matter how we look at a particular issue, the decision cannot be otherwise. Thus, one accepts for the sake of an argument hypotheses which were not really justified in order to show that even if they were, the validity of the decision would not be effective. Naturally, when it comes to explaining the real motivation for the decision, the response may be downright misleading because the positive reason for the law may not be adequately stressed. And Rav Rabinovitch worked this way. He would write tshuvot, and he would read tshuvot as not being purely straightforward. A good example of this is his rulings about converting children. The poskim were very hesitant to allow converting of children throughout the exile because often the conversion of children would be used to justify later the conversion of adults who weren't actually interested in fully observing Judaism. They were interested in converting in order to get married. And what would end up happening would be not that the conversion would not then draw the uninterested partner into Judaism, it would draw the interested partner out of Judaism. And he claims that nowadays the situation is different, and that we all we're living in the land of Israel in a Jewish state, where often the ruling should be the opposite, meaning that allowing the conversion of a child may draw in a less interested partner and allow that less interested partner to actually join the Jewish people. And it may be that there are many less interested individuals who are interested in being Jewish generally, and the idea of being Jewish generally in a Jewish state won't lead to assimilation, but would actually lead to those people becoming part of the Jewish people and observing the Torah more. And so the ruling that can be found in those tshuvot needs to be understood in the context in which it was written, even if that reasoning isn't explicitly stated in the tshuva. Even if it's just the underlying thought, the underlying reasoning which led the posek to what he said, and it's not mentioned, meaning an individual halachic arbiter needs to understand the motivations behind the psikah always, even when they're not written. And again, our time is coming to a close, so I'll only mention one final point. There's much more to talk about Rabinovitch, but one final point, about how a posek works, and how you're able to actually balance between the fundamental understanding of an individual Talmudic ruling and the needs of society and the needs of an individual, which is that he said to me often that a posek needs to do two things when studying the sources. One, he needs to understand what the Talmud, what the Gemara actually says, and what the best, most critically proper understanding of any particular sugya is. And alongside that, he needs to read all of the various precedence is and understand what the field of reasonable interpretation is. Meaning there are two separate statements. What you think the proper interpretation is after all criticisms, and what the field of reasonable interpretations could be. Meaning your criticism can be answered. It's very rare that there's a knockdown criticism of any particular opinion. But, so therefore, a posek needs to be able to grasp both of those things. When he can, he'll go according to his rigorous understanding of what the Talmud says. But when he needs to, he can then rely on various plausible, if in his mind incorrect, interpretations of the sugya to reach the goals of the Torah. And there, in that way, he can allow both the texts and the particular precedences and the goals of the Torah to lead him. And that brings me back to where I started, meaning that any posek must always have the underlying philosophical understanding of the Torah in mind, and he must always be a critical thinker. And those, I think, are the two fundamental things that if you take anything away from Rav Rabinovitch, you should take away, are critical thought and rigor, always finding the best interpretation of any particular source, and the deep philosophical underpinnings and understanding what the goals of the Torah are and how any particular ruling actually brings that into practical application through the law. Our time's up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach. That was beautiful, super enlightening, very well structured. We really appreciate your time and your expertise and sharing with us some of what you've learned from the Rosh Yeshiva and your deep study of his work. So thank you very much. And we look forward to having you again on other topics which you are an expert in. For those who don't know, Zach is the author of a book on the thought of the Rambam and his political philosophy and the way that he views the transmission of the Torah called Kechol Hayam, which is potentially available in bookstores everywhere. Maybe not. You could definitely
contacting me.
Right. So we can take care of that for you if you'd like. Just to let you know, our next upcoming shiur is in 2 weeks' time with Rabbi Daniel Roslar of London. He's going to be talking to us about the role of Achronim in the halachic decision-making process. And yes, of course, there will be a recording put up in the coming days on YouTube. Wishing everybody a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you.